Indigenous people can be identified by geographic region, including Northeast, Southeast, Plains, and Southwest. There were perhaps 10 million people, estimates vary, before 1492, and 574 federally recognized tribes. There are now about 3.7 million, plus almost 6 million people of mixed race. Algonquins and Iroquois were major confederations in New England and into New York. The Mississippians in the southeast, farmers and pueblo builders in the southwest, nomadic tribes on the plains and west coast. Most were farmers, adapted for different conditions. The Plains Indians were exceptions, relying on nomadic life following the bison herds. The other exception was some West Coast tribes that relied on abundant seafood. The Iroquois, they called themselves Haudenosaunee, people of the Longhouse, was a confederation in the northeast U.S. of the Cayuga, Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, and Seneca, later joined by the Tuscarora. By the year 1000, they formed the Three Sisters. Legend has it that Hiawatha created the Great Law of Peace, requiring consensus. Females were the heads of clans and chose the male sachem, close to social equality. Charles Mann asked a group of experts if they would prefer being a European or Iroquois. They all chose Iroquois. Algonquins now live mainly in eastern Canada. They lived primarily by hunting and fishing, although more southern members practiced farming. Iroquois farming was split between the sexes. Men cleared the fields and women did the planting. The men most often used burning techniques to clear the land. The women used wooden spades to make mounds, then planted the Three Sisters seeds, plus tomatoes and other crops. Being this far north limited the growing season, requiring more reliance on other foods. Iroquois foods included succotash and pemmican, which is tallow, dried meat, and possibly berries, plus their own versions of clam chowder, hominy, corn soup, cranberry sauce, cornbread, baked beans, and tomato-based stews. They made sweet nut bread out of corn flour, hickory, and hazelnuts, ground maple syrup held together in cornstalks. They used large wooden spoons and carved wooden bowls. They had their own methods for keeping food, including storage racks in huts, while corn and squash hung from the ceiling. Meats and fish were smoked or sun-dried. Vegetables like beans were dried and kept in containers with thick lids. Ceramic pots also were used for corn and other vegetables and meats, which could be buried in pits inside longhouses. Maple syrup came from sugar maple trees plus other maples with a high sugar content. Legends have maple sap initially used to cook venison served to the chiefs. The process began with the start of spring thaw. V-shaped cuts were made in the tree trunk, reeds inserted for the sap to run into clay buckets or woven baskets. The collected sap was boiled in clay pots to produce maple syrup. Today, most maple syrup is produced in Quebec. Mississippians of the central U.S., especially in the Ohio Valley, built thousands of mounds. The culture lasted roughly from 800 to 1600, based primarily around the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. They mastered farming based on the Three Sisters. Archaeological finds included textiles and stone pipes indicating they grew cotton and tobacco. The Mississippians had to create crop varieties compatible with the colder climate and shorter growing seasons. This is called the Eastern Agricultural Complex. They grew indigenous grasses for grains, now considered weeds. The earthen mounds meant settlements and a hierarchy that developed into chieftains, centralized government, and religion, plus the usual inequality. They worked copper mainly by hammering, but did not practice metallurgy. Cahokia started about 950, not far from what became St. Louis, and lasted roughly 300 years, really the only major city north of the Rio Grande. This was a busy port city and trade central across much of the future U.S., including the Rocky Mountains, Great Lakes, Gulf of Mexico, and the Atlantic Ocean. Large granaries were needed both to facilitate trade and winter storage. A large and expanding city-state meant clearing thousands of acres, removing ground cover, which increased flooding. They did plant orchards for fruit and nut-bearing trees like pecans, walnuts, and chestnuts. Europeans appreciated the trees without a thought for the humans involved. Cahokia never recovered from an earthquake at the start of the 13th century. With overpopulation and increased flooding, the city collapsed. The indigenous peoples of the Southeast were usually identified by common cultural characteristics. They included the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Seminole, and dozens of others. As with the Mississippians, farming concentrated on the Three Sisters. Trade was important, especially for salt, pottery, and luxury goods. Settlements tended to be local villages with ceremonial centers, housing up to 1,000 people. The ancient Pueblo builders built Mesa Verde, Chaco Canyon, and Canyon de Chelly. The culture likely started 3,000 years ago. When Coronado arrived in the 1540s, the Pueblo Indians had a successful culture of perhaps 70 settlements with terraced dwellings, practicing farming of the Three Sisters and more, plus cotton for clothing. Of course, Coronado attacked, expecting the city of Cibola. Puebloans were known for their pottery, which was used for cooking and storage. They made considerable use of decorated pottery, and this was later used to date the sites, like black painted designs on white backgrounds, used for several hundred years. The Puebloans grew corn, beans, and squash, mainly on mesa tops. They were dependent on rain. They used dry farming with terracing, check dams to slow water flow, and mulching using pumice. This was supplemented by other available foods, including piñon nuts, yucca fruit, seeds, and greens, plus meat from hunting. Water was the major issue. With summer rains intermittent, they depended on snowmelt for most of their water needs and river tributaries when available. The ancient Puebloans disappeared late in the 12th century. Drought was the likely cause, exacerbated by deforestation, erosion, and so on. Apache and Navajo peoples arrived in the Southwest around 1400 from northwestern Canada as hunter-gatherers. Because of trade, Navajos learned farming from Puebloans. Later, they adopted sheep herding from the Spaniards. Then women started to spin and weave. Navajo would serve as code talkers during World War II. Apache farming was limited, with most food from hunting and gathering, as well as trading and raiding. Apaches were known for fighting Europeans for centuries. The final group to be defeated in 1886 was led by Geronimo. These were the indigenous people of the Great Plains and Canadian prairies. Some tribes specialized in hunting bison and migrating with the herds even before horses arrived with the Spanish. These included the Arapaho, Cheyenne, Comanche, and Lakota Sioux. Others were farmers, planting corn and other Mesoamerican crops, and also hunting bison. These included the Iowa, Mandan, Osage, and Dakota. Spanish horses changed the culture beginning in the 16th century, with tribes shifting to a fully mounted nomadic culture. The coastal Indians from northern California as far as British Columbia and into Alaska relied on salmon, allowing dense populations with unique cultures and complexity. Salmon were roasted or smoked and dried to last through the winter. Hunting involved both land animals and hunting at sea, like whales, sea lions, and porpoises. Some groups had what was called forest gardens of wild plums and cherries, hazelnuts, and other trees. They planted bulbs on tilled land, harvested root crops, and ate berries and fruits. Many managed their environment for long-term success. Their most noted art form was the creation of totem poles depicting legends and history. I've tried to list major indigenous groups, but there are still groups and regions left out. The Great Basin, for example, was between the Rockies and Sierra Nevada mountains. They were hunter-gatherers, including the Ute, Paiute, and Western Shoshone. California had additional dozens, the largest of which was the Yurok, along the Klamath River of Northern California. They were decimated by disease after the California gold rush in the mid-19th century. Now it's on to the European invasion of the New World, beginning with the Spanish in Mexico and beyond, next time on Food History and Mystery.